John sits in his luxurious office, reflecting on his dream life, a flourishing business, a loving family, and an abundance of material success. He glances at a clock, a symbol of his deep respect for time, ensuring not a single second is wasted. John shares his philosophy with a colleague, emphasizing that time is the most valuable asset, and wasting it is akin to falling behind. However, despite his accomplishments, John begins to feel restless, as if his forward momentum hasn't truly taken him anywhere meaningful. At home, John gazes at his family and feels a pang of emptiness, wondering why fulfillment eludes him despite everything. One sunny morning, John decides to clear his head with a walk in the park. He notices a man sitting on a bench, intently observing his watch. Intrigued, John approaches him. The man, Greg, introduces himself as a physicist and explains that he has spent years studying time. John, curious, asks Greg why time fascinates him so much. Greg smiles and says, "Time intrigues me because it rules everything in this physical universe, and yet, most people act like they own it." John, confused, asks, "What do you mean by that?" Greg explains, "People constantly talk about using time wisely, moving with it, or not wasting it. But think about this. How can you waste something that owns you?" John, slightly defensive, replies, "So what's wrong with moving ahead with time?" Greg counters, "You can waste something that you own, like money. On the contrary, time totally owns and governs us. That is why we say, his time was over when someone dies, or he is having the time of his life when things are good, or time heals everything when things get tough. Time controls us, not the other way around." John pauses, then admits, "I've spent my life trying to stay ahead of time, yet I feel like I've reached nowhere. Why is that?" Greg leans forward and says, "Because time is not what you think it is. Newton said time is absolute. Einstein said it's relative. But both missed the most profound truth about time." John's curiosity intensifies. "What is that truth?" he asks. Greg reveals, "Time is simply cyclical. It repeats itself. This is why people feel stuck despite achieving so much. Ruled by time, they end up moving in circles." Greg continues, "People try to move with time, but don't they notice that the clock needle keeps returning to the same spot? Hence time never allows us to move ahead." John nods slowly, relating deeply. "That explains why I feel stagnant even with everything I have. But why can't I stop chasing more?" Greg replies, "Because time's repetitive nature traps you in a cycle of desires, thoughts, and actions. It's the illusion of progress. It is because of time that we get repetitive kind of thoughts, which eventually control our life." John asks eagerly, "So how do we break free from this cycle?" Greg responds, "You can only transcend time when you disconnect from the time-bound self. True freedom lies in the non-physical dimension." "What do you mean by the non-physical dimension?" John asks, puzzled. Greg explains, "Science has long focused on the physical plane, but now we know of a non-physical intelligence that exists beyond time-space. It's the key to liberation." John shakes his head and says, "I don't fully understand." Greg elaborates, "When the body dies, we call it death. But if you can disconnect from your body and mind while you are alive, you reach a state of enlightenment. beyond time's grip. You get freedom from cyclical physical laws. John, intrigued but skeptical, asks, "How can I possibly do that?" Greg sighs and says, "We've overvalued the physical plane, mistaking the mind's thinking for true intelligence. Once we view something as intelligence, we cannot let go of it. Only when we realize our limited nature, we would truly bow down." John listens intently as Greg continues. "We're like machines governed by time, without true free will. Realizing that your so-called intelligence has made you like a puppet, you would dare to drop it." Greg adds, "The goal isn't to conquer time but to recognize how deeply we're enslaved by it. That humility leads to devotion." "What do you mean by devotion?" John asks. Greg replies, "Devotion means being devoid of the self. It is a realization that comes when we understand that our physical structures are nothing but a trap that are governed by physical laws of space-time." John looks down, the weight of Greg's words sinking in. He feels a spark of hope, sensing a new path ahead. As they part ways, Greg encourages John, "Do not try to experience the non-physical. Just try to admit your limited physical nature, and eventually you will bow down." Greg concludes by saying, "Remember that you cannot become spiritual by effort, but by letting go of the physical, and you will only let go of it once you stop seeing yourself as a form of intelligence." Walking away, John feels lighter. For the first time, he begins to see time not as something to master but as a teacher, guiding him towards deeper truths. If you liked this video, then do like, share and subscribe to our channel.